Welcome, welcome. My name is Karina Bennett, and I'm joining you today from rainy Portland, Oregon. We are so happy to have you here. I am the director of Surface Design Association. We're an international nonprofit organization that focuses on fiber and textile arts, and we publish the quarterly Surface Design Journal, which has been bringing the best of contemporary fiber art to readers for nearly 50 years. We're so happy to be here today. I am delighted to welcome you to this week's talk, Intertwining Identities with Verónica A. Pèrez. Textile Talk webinars are brought to you by the International Quilt Museum, Quilt Alliance, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. Before we start, we have a few housekeeping announcements. This is a webinar, so your screens and mics are not active or showing. We welcome questions, which we will answer at the end of the artist's presentation. Please do submit them in the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. We are honored to bring you free and inspiring Textile Talk programming. We respectfully ask that you be courteous as you engage with speakers, moderators, and other participants. Your chat comments can be seen by everyone. As I said, please use the Q&A box for questions and the chat box for greeting others. We have a survey for your commentary and ways we can improve. It's always helpful to complete that. If you prefer not to see notifications from chat, if they're distracting, you can click on the chat button to toggle them off on your screen. So earlier this month, we welcomed 19 different presenting artists to our 2025 symposium. And today we're pleased to present our keynote presentation, Intertwining Identities with Verónica A. Pèrez, to you all today. We're playing a recording of the presentation from the symposium, and then we're lucky to have Verónica here with us for a conversation and to answer questions at the end of the presentation. You can put your Q&As, your questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll get to them at the end with Verónica. I'm now pleased to introduce Verónica. Verónica A. Pèrez is an artist whose work is deeply rooted in community. Through their braiding circle workshops, they explore themes of erasure, identity, and interdependency. In 2023, Pèrez was awarded the St. Baudouliff Club Foundation Emerging Artist Award and the Amelia Peabody Award for Sculpture Excellence. Recent honors include the Maine Arts Commission Maine Artist Fellows for 2024 in Fine Arts, as well as the Elias Beauregard 2024 Project Grant. Currently, Pèrez works as the administrative assistant at the Black-led arts and residency organization Indigo Arts Alliance in Portland, Maine, as co-organizer of Tender Table, and on the Southern Maine Workers Center Board of Directors and the Policy Committee for the Opportunity Alliance. Verónica Pèrez resides in Westbrook, Maine, with their partner and child. We're going to go ahead and play this video, and we will join you at the end with Verónica for a Q&A session. Thank you so much.
So I'm so excited to be here with all of you today, and I'll be reading from some notes. So if you see my eyes shift, that's the whole reason why. And I'm hoping that everybody can hear me. Next slide, please. So I'll jump right into it. I like to start with a little front loading of, inspirations, why I create, and some familial and cultural history, because I feel like it grounds my work and helps folks understand it better. Next slide, please. This is my father. He was a part of the Puerto Rican diaspora, and he is a big, huge reason of why I do all of the work that I do. When he came here from Puerto Rico in about the 1950s, a lot of his culture was left behind. And so as you'll see, as I continue the presentation, a lot of my work considers this. Next slide, please. This is one of the images so when I was growing up, I never really had images of my father. And these were some images of my father, the black and white image that I had found through working with a historian of him. And it's really touching to see my daughter in the colored photo of the two similarities between them, because I feel like, history obviously repeats itself, and also there's something to be learned from generations past. Next slide, please. These are images of my father's mother. I never really knew her. My father was really estranged from his family for his whole life. And so that's why I had to use a historian to find out these images. And that distance became mine too. He didn't even hear about his mother's passing until after the funeral had already taken place. And by then it was too late to say goodbye, too late to ask the questions that he and I had. And yet these images, you know, in front of me, they keep pulling me in, they intrigue me. And maybe because they're all I have of her. She's a presence without a story, a face without a voice. Looking at them makes me both happy and sad, you know, really happy because she existed, but I can see her because there's proof of life, but it's sad because it's like just beyond my reach, a part of history that remains untouched. And in a lot of this, I think about mothers, I think about matriarchy, about what it means to look past this lens through the image of a woman that I've never known, but in a lot of ways shaped who I am today. Mothers are everything to us. They hold entire worlds inside of them. And, you know, sometimes they can feel very alien, very distant, very unknowing. They're kind of like ghosts lingering at the edge of our lives. And I really keep coming back to these images. I don't know if you can see my studio behind me, but the images are very prominent on my wall in every studio that I've been in. And it's always searching for something, maybe for her or maybe for something of myself. Next slide, please. This is also an image of my father's mother with him on the side with a little Band-Aid on his face, and then his brothers, which I've never met his brothers either. But what really struck me about this image was the image of the braids. And when I look at this image, I realize that weaving and braiding has become much more than just a technique for me. It's a form of repair. It's a way to mend the fractures left by generational trauma, a way to reach back into the past and grasp something that white supremacy has really tried to erase. I didn't really start braiding with this intention. At first, it was just an action, a process. It was really a way to make these structures very stable. But over time, I really understood that each twist and turn was an attempt to make sense of the gaps in the history and the gaps in my history and the gaps of Puerto Rican history as a whole. And it was really to reclaim something that was taken from me. A lot of the times I'm working from a space of not knowing, you know, these people in the photographs, I don't know them, but I can feel them in my studio. They're a part of me even in their absence. My father was estranged for his family, and I never really knew why. And because of that, I never really got to meet them. I have no stories, no direct memories passed down, just these fragmented photos. But within the act of this braiding, I created a bridge between myself and them, and it became a way to reach for what was lost and to feel connected to a lineage that I never got to know and feel so disconnected from. The process in itself becomes this kind of like storytelling, and one that doesn't rely on words since I'm a visual textile artist, but on movement, intention, and care. Braiding is my way of piecing together what history tried to unravel, and it's a way of saying, I am still here and we're still here. Next slide, please. So a lot of my other, I wouldn't want to say inspiration, but a lot of my other content comes from the history of Puerto Rico and erasure as a real life horror. And the systemic erasure of Puerto Rican history is more terrifying than any horror movie. And we'll get into that a little bit later as well. This kind of trauma is real and its effect lasts for generations. I bring up this documentary called La Operación, and it's a 1980s documentary about the forced sterilization of women in Puerto Rico. And this isn't just a story about Puerto Rico. I mean, this has happened in America. This has happened in India. This has happened in places where white European people want to colonize a place and erase the people that were there for their own monetary and powerful gain. I mean, we still even see it happening today with everything that's happening. And, you know, I would say a lot about that, but I only have about, 30 minutes to speak. So a lot of that comes from this history of Puerto Rico, because not only was my family pulled away from me in that way, but the whole entire history of Puerto Rico was erased in that way too. Next slide, please. You can see here as the Spanish conquistadors and Christopher Columbus were erasing the Taino people, the indigenous people from Puerto Rico, and they were virtually extinct by the 1500s. Next slide, please. I also look to Puerto Rican nationalists, people who risked everything to put their lives on the line to reclaim Puerto Rico, like Pedro Abizu Campos or Lolita Lebron. These people refused to be silent, who saw that weight of colonial rule and decided to push back. They were not just rebels, they are freedom fighters, and they understood that the fight for Puerto Rico was a fight for survival, for its culture, for its language, and for its history, and for its people, most importantly, because so many times European and white colonizers use people as commodities and people as just like things instead of seeing the empathy and humanity within us all. They knew this cost of resistance and they chose to stand up for it. You know, their legacy is not just one of struggle, but of love, for a land that has been taken and retaken, and for a people who have been displaced and erased. They fought so that Puerto Rico could be itself again. I look to these people for strength, for guidance, for proof that resistance is necessary, that the fight for self-determination is never over. In their stories, I really see the echoes of my own, searching, of reclaiming, and refusing to be erased. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about hair, a little bit about braiding, because I do some of that. Next slide. So braiding through time, hair is history, identity, and essence. And hair has always held meaning, at least for me. And I feel like for a lot of other people too. And it's more than just a material. It's memory, it's culture, identity, and power, like really woven together. You know, I look at the history and I see how hair has been used to communicate, to signify, and to connect. As you can see from the skull, this is a hairstyle from 3,000 years ago, preserved on an ancient Egyptian head, and speaks to the practice of adornment and identity that has endured for a millennia. And what really intrigues me about this is that the skin, everything else is gone, but the hair remains as a powerful symbol. And as you can see on the two black and white pictures on the right, these braided Rapunzels of Nambia, where every stage of life is reflected in the hair, showing how deep personal and cultural hair can be, and how it tells story of who we are and where we've been. Next slide, please. You can also see the 500-year-old Inca mummy braids. You know, it reminds me, as I said previously, that hair is one of the few materials that withstand time, holding on to the past long after this body is gone. You know, these historical references are not just artifacts, they're inspirations. They show that hair has always been more than just a strand growing from our heads. It's this vessel that carries history, lineage, and identity. It's a way of marking time, expressing selfhood, and holding on to something very, very sacred. Next slide. These are some contemporary inspirations that I get. And even today, hair remains a powerful material, whether in, you know, contemporary art, cultural traditions, or personal ritual. It continues to serve as a connection between past and present. It holds energy, memory, and essence. And hair is the ultimate material, alive, intimate, and as I said, personal. It's a thread between generations. It's a language of its own, and a form of resistance, beauty, and belonging. Next slide, please. And we can even see this in very contemporary things that have happened with the colonization of Gaza, and the way that these children remember their parents through their hair. Next slide, please. Inspiration, question mark. Next slide. So a lot of the inspiration I get is not only from my familial and cultural history, but I am like a very big horror movie buff. And horror has always been a way to reveal the unspeakable, to expose kind of what lurks beneath the surface. And I use horror to expose and show the depths of generational trauma, because sometimes, well, most of the time, truth is way more terrifying than fiction. There's some messed up stuff going on. The weight of history, the pain passed down through generations, the erasure and the violence, it doesn't just disappear. It lingers, it haunts, and reshapes us in a way that we might not even realize. And horror allows me to bring that to light, making the unseen visible. These are just some of my favorites. This isn't a comprehensive list. I can provide anybody with a comprehensive list if they want it, but these are just some of the ones that have sparked me over the past couple of years while I am creating my art. Next slide. My work really exists in this space between creation and destruction, between the beauty of survival and the horror of what has been endured. Horror isn't just about fear. It's a vehicle to tell the different side of the story and a way to make people feel the impact of the history in their bones. I'm also a really big fan of Japanese horror as well. They just have such a visceral way of showing body horror, and they tend to use a lot of black hair in their films, which I'll get into a little bit later. Next slide, please. This is some excerpts from Junji Ito manga, and he is a manga artist. And he really forces us to confront the things that we try to bury, which is the way that I work as well. It turns trauma into something tangible, something you can't look away from, because sometimes the only way to truly understand the weight of what's been lost is to force this darkness head on. Next slide. Artistic influences. So I have 3 of them. Next slide. The first one is Doris Salcedo and her monumental sculptures. One of the reasons I really love Doris Salcedo is because she has this concept of social sculpture, and it's the possibility of giving form to society through art. You know, she talks about social sculpture as it opens the conversation to include knowledge greater than oneself. The sculpture becomes the meeting place for the work and the viewer to unfold together. She says, and I'm going to read a quick quote from her, "To place the invisible experience of marginal people in a space is to find a place to write, to develop life. So there is no way of isolating living experiences from spatial experiences." Next slide. Peta Coyne is also one of my biggest influences as well, for her use of hair and the way that she talks about materials. Next slide. Shakaya Booker is also one of my big art crushes. And it's because of the way that she transforms these tires into something completely different. Next slide. So now we'll get into the work. Now that I've front loaded you with all the information, now it's time to look at the work and some of the communities that I've created through the work. Next slide. So this is one of my earliest pieces that I started using hair. I started using hair because somebody in grad school gave me a bag of hair and they were like, "I think you could use this." And I was like, you know what? I think you're right. And so I was always trying to manifest the body, but I realized that I was always trying to manifest it with these materials that were wood, were concrete, were construction materials, and really weren't alluding to those human and empathy parts that I was trying to talk about. So when somebody gave me that bag of hair, I was like, yes, I could definitely use it. And this is one of the first pieces that I created. And as you can see, the construction materials are still there, but the hair is in the middle, breaking it apart and making it come apart, just to show how strong and how archival the hair is. Next slide. This was still really early in my process. I don't even use blonde hair anymore. I specifically use black and brown hair, and we'll get into that a little bit later of why. But this is me. It's a smaller sculpture. It's not that big. She's about 15 inches tall, but I'm still trying to figure out these forms. What shape do these take? Do they have a shape, or are they just amorphous and organic? Next slide. Again, trying to figure out these forms and really delving into using the black and brown hair a lot. She's not that big either. She might be 36 inches high, but still trying to figure out what form these guys take. Next slide. I decided to make some freestanding forms because I am a sculptor, and so I tried to bring it out into space. And I did a whole series on this piece, which is Nikki, and the next piece you'll see, which is Reba. I did a series on women who had inspired me, and this one is a la Nicki Minaj. Next slide. And this one is Reba, after Reba McEntire. And so really trying to take the essence of who they are through their hair and imbue that within a sculpture. Next slide. So in 2020, I really shifted into using history for the first time, and I was asked to do a project from Space Gallery in Portland, Maine. And the project was called Recite. And basically what you were doing was you were reframing history through your personal lens. I remember when I first looked at the project proposal from them, you know, they had history from, you know, all parts of Maine, but there was no Latinx history. And I was like, that's a little strange. And so, you know, I ended up working with a historian from Bates College, and we found out that the West Indies and Puerto Rico really had a handle in the foundation of Portland, Maine through their trade of rum, brown sugar, and white sugar. And so I thought it was, I mean, I use funny, but I didn't think it was funny. I thought it was kind of like, oh, so they just basically, you know, and I mean, colonization and white supremacy does this. They largely left out people of color in the foundation of Portland, Maine. And so with this piece, what I did was I created 15 arms, casts of mannequin arms, and they were made out of sugar. And I put hair on the inside of them, and I placed them on the Eastern Promenade in Portland. And as the water came in, it erased the hair, but it erased the sugar, excuse me, but the hair was still standing as like a nod to, you know, you can try and erase us, but, you know, we're still here. Next slide. So here's my little hair blanket, and I show you the video just to show you the weight of the blanket and how heavy it had become. You know, I was thinking of blankets. I was thinking a lot about how tapestries tell stories like layers of the earth. And just the same as I was talking about hair previously, you know, hair is like the strata in the earth where it shows the different layers and different things of what was happening. And that's what I was thinking about when I created this piece. Next slide. At this point in 2020, I was still making work that kind of pushed the boundaries of what was going on politically. At that time, that person was talking about putting up borders and putting up walls, as he still is today. And so I'm trying to think of a way to break those walls down. And so I started working with fencing, chain link fence, and started putting the hair and weaving it through there just to show, just to make the surface more malleable so you can pass through it, to show that like people can break down these borders. We can break down these borders with empathy and humanity. Next slide. So along the fencing, along with the chain link fencing, I was able to do historical silencing again. And with this work, I wanted to change it up a bit. I don't think it was that effective the first time. And when I went to take video of it, I left my little GoPro there, and the GoPro actually got taken out by the ocean. So I never got that footage from the first iteration that I did. But from the second iteration, I chose to take a chain link dog fence, and I made sugar arms, about 350 pounds of sugar arms, and did the same thing where I put the hair inside of it. Next slide, please. And I put it down on the Eastern Prom, and as you can see, here's the hair and the sugar kind of piled on top of each other. And next slide, which is a video of the hair kind of melting away as the ocean comes up and as the ocean takes the sugar out. And in this instance, I was thinking a lot about how, you know, the hair was still there, but people are still trapped. People are still being erased. People are still being forcefully eradicated from history, even though we are still here. And luckily this time, not to make a joke out of it, my camera did not get taken away by the ocean. But as you can see, it was months and months of work, and within 30 seconds, that hair was erased. And I really wanted that to be a palpable sentiment in this work as well, too. Next slide. So this is my community work, and I put this kind of in the middle of my works because it does inform and influence what I'm doing. Next slide. Tender Table. I love Tender Table. Tender Table is an organization that supports Black and Brown people through storytelling and food. And you can see the picture up on the corner of the 3 people. That's Jenny Ibsen, myself in the middle, and Frankie Tran, and they are my 2 co-organizers. And so we organize things like the middle picture is a event that we hold every year called the Food and Art Festival. And the one in the bottom corner is a poetry reading with Portland Poet Laureate Maya Williams. And these are mostly affinity spaces for BIPOC people, poetry readings, ramen nights, things that make space for BIPOC people and their issues in this world. Sometimes we do talk about racial issues. Most of the time we don't, because it's a space for us to exist and to live in the world. Next slide. This is a sampling of just the night market posters that we have had. And we're up to 4 so far. So if you're in Portland next year during August, come to the 5th one. Next slide. We also did this project called Radical Nourishment, which is based on Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And we really talked a lot about different ways to engender understanding and belonging, and gave BIPOC people the autonomy to understand how we can survive in these really dire times. We did things such as you can see here, a farming workshop. We did a blacksmithing workshop, a fire building workshop. So tools to learn and tools to understand how to exist in this world as we see it now, and also to take up space in spaces that we have been pushed out of for so long. Next slide. And now I come to the braiding circles. So the braiding circles is one of my most favorite projects that I've ever done. And as you can see here, we're all in a circle and we're braiding, and that's basically what the braiding circles are. They started as kind of a way to make pieces for the larger sculptures, but it ended up, when we were braiding together, we ended up just talking about, you know, these things that had affected us as BIPOC people through the lens of our hair. And so that's what they became. They became spaces for people to be vulnerable and trust the people around them and really confront these hard truths through art making and through oral storytelling. Because what happens is we braid hair, I take the braided hair, as you'll see in some later pieces, and I put the braids on the piece, and then I collect oral stories from people as well. And those are shown within the sculpture to kind of give this visceral sense of understanding people and engendering empathy. Next slide. I think we might be able to skip this, if that's okay. So these are some of the stories that I have collected. I can share within my website. We won't play it now, but within my website is an example of some of the stories that I have collected. And people are very generous in sharing these stories with me, and you can listen to them. Next slide. So this is the work that emerges from the braiding circles. This was in 2022. And so all of the braids on this piece were created by people at the braiding circles. And then I take them back to the studio, as I said before, slap them on a structure. And inside of the piece as well is a Bluetooth speaker playing these stories. And like I said, it's just a different way for people to engage with the work in this way, because I know when you're butted up against sculpture, I really enjoy sculpture like Doris Salcedo, like Peta Coyne, like Shakaya Booker, that kind of confronts you with, and you can feel it through your whole body because it's bigger than you. But when you hear a voice coming from it as well, it just makes you hear and feel things in a different way. Next slide. I also wanted to create the braid as like a huge, like take a piece of hair and expand it, you know, 1,000 times. And so these are satin tubes that I created and then wove together, really looking into the braid, why I was interested in the braid, and what really grabs me about using the braid. Next slide. This is another piece called suspension. You know, I think, obviously, I think a lot about sculpture. I think about the ways in which the body moves. I'm not a, you know, sculptor by trade where I'm like hammering out some marble, but I still feel that these elude that bodily form of, you know, laying in a casket or laying somewhere with these pieces coming down. Next slide. This is another piece. It's called I Search for You. And I just also really like to weave hair in kind of different ways. Next slide. This was a piece that was shown at the University of Gorham, the University of Maine Gorham campus during a solo show. And I did a residency there. And I want to back up a little bit and talk about trauma. Because when I was at this residency, I was confronted with, well, you know, when you're doing these braiding circles, you're bringing up a lot of traumatic memories for people. And I was like, you know what? Not that I had never thought about that, but I guess I had always been on the tip that, like, if people are sharing these traumatic stories, maybe there's some healing through it. But I had to educate myself on how these traumatic stories might make people not feel so good after they shared them. And so, you know, trauma is something we carry in different ways. And I really believe that it's really important to highlight and not exploit it, and not to just to put it on display, but to find ways to acknowledge and repair it. You know, I don't want to just expose this trauma and leave someone with a ripped open chest. I want to transform it and repair it. And I feel that braiding becomes that act of repair. You know, a way to take something painful and turn it into something communal and something really healing. The forms I create aren't meant to intimidate as well. They aren't meant to overwhelm. Instead, I want them to be soft, welcoming, and familiar. You know, I want them to invite people in rather than pushing them away. They hold this really traumatic history, but they're also meant to hold that comfort. I'll also talk a little bit about the color black, the color that carries so much weight and so much meaning. And black and brown hair is historically politicized, coded, and controlled, and it really becomes for me a material of resistance and power. And black can symbolize many things: absence, mystery, and fear. But what I focus on is the depth and the power that it creates. Next slide. This is an installation view just to give you an idea of how big the pieces are. Because again, I really want them to take you over and to take you to another realm. Next slide. This is another work called The Last Dream Before. It's kind of like a string of pearls of balls of hair that are coming together. Next slide. This is ecotone and ecotone. An ecotone is a place, and it's usually used in like a scientific term, where two different environments come together. So living in Maine, I think of a marsh, I think of fresh water, and I think of salt water coming together. And in those kinds of places, it's really teeming with life and teeming with different kinds of life, which I really found exciting, and a way to express that, you know, these two different things coming together don't destroy each other, but they create this life from these two radically different environments. Next piece. Next slide, sorry. Another work called Infinite Distance. I really also like crocheting a lot, so I learned how to crochet these little baskets. And as you can see, there's hair pouring out of the middle, again, symbolizing that, you know, we're still here and we're not going to go anywhere. Next slide. This work is called Hereditary, also one of my favorite movies. And I took a lot of the braids and a lot of the softer forms that I was making and tried to make this kind of like DNA-esque strand all kind of clumped together in a very abstract way on the wall. And you can see a lot of my works are very abstract, are very organic. And I think that engenders people to think a little bit more about humans, humanity, and empathy. And I know I keep repeating myself talking about empathy, but I feel like that's what I want my work to engender. I want it to engender empathy, because if we lose that, then we've really lost our way in this world. Next slide. Braided echoes. I took another set of my huge, soft sculptural pieces and braided them together. Next slide. Gathered Essence. This work was shown at the Chocolate Church in Bath, Maine, just this last year. And this one also housed the Bluetooth speaker as well. Next slide. I really also like to show, like the previous work and this work, I've really started to show the really soft, light works with the really heavy works, because I feel like within that comparison and within that composition, there is a difference of weight, there's a difference of feeling. And to shift from something very heavy to very light, I feel like gives the viewer, I think excitement is the wrong word, but I feel like maybe makes the viewer think of things in a different way when they're looking at these two disparate pieces. Next slide. I also started working with beads a lot, and I took a basket making class from an indigenous basket maker, and their name is Sarah Sockbison. And I've realized that baskets and vases have become a really palpable symbol in my work as well too. I'm not really sure why, because I've just started working with them a lot more. So maybe down the road, I'll see why. Next slide. This is one of the newest pieces that I've done. And so now I am still working with hair, but I am working a lot with gems and jewels and these things that are sparkling. And, I talked earlier about destruction and creation, and I feel like there's this ebb and flow in destruction and creation where something is being destroyed, but out of those ashes, something is being created. So this work is starting to symbolize those things that I'm doing. Next slide. This is the poem that came from that. I worked with Portland Poet Laureate Maya Williams to create a poem for this piece, which is also available on my website, and you can read it there as well too. Next slide. So again, some of the newer works are really engendering this, they're not as textile heavy. There's still elements of textile in it, such as like braided nets, braided hair, but they're really focusing on this idea of creation and destruction. Next slide. And this is my Mary. She's somewhere behind me. I'm rhinestoning her face. She has the hair, and really thinking about how religion has played a role in the decimation of people and communities. And I believe that that's the last slide. Next slide. Thank you. I really appreciate you all listening, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Kedra.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. Veronica, thank you so much for that. It's lovely to revisit that presentation. I enjoyed it the first time, and I have a whole page of notes from the second time. So thanks for coming back. We're going to jump into the Q&A portion of today. If you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can. Looks like we have a good amount of time to answer questions. I'm going to start off just kind of situating your work. As part of our symposium, we had some artist studio visits, and one of the artists that we had, Joey Quinones, is a professor in the fiber department at Cranbrook, and I found it really interesting that they really made a point of saying they see themselves as a textile artist. They are clearly situated in the realm of textiles, even though the majority of the work that Joey uses is metal, ceramics, wood. And so I'm so curious with you use soft sculpture, weaving, braids, crochet, basketry, but you clearly have a sculpture background. I'm wondering where you put yourself, and does it matter, and why?
When you sent me this question yesterday, I love this question so much because it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time. when I was in grad school and I was studying textile work, it was always considered women's work and thus lower and just like not a forum. If you really want to engage with the conversation, like textiles isn't the way to do it. And so I was like, well, that's not right. And so, I would always call myself a sculptor. And moving forward, people kind of gave me the nomenclature of being a textile artist. And I started appreciating that and thinking back to my grad school days, like, no, this is like a great, like, I like being called a textile artist. I call myself a sculptor, a textile artist, but, or whatever have you, an artist in general. But I think there's something really special about being a textile artist and kind of front loading your work in a space where, um, people, they're like, you won't be taken seriously if you are a textile artist. And it's like, no, like there still can be very serious textile work in that realm. And so I appreciate being given the name of textile artist because I didn't call myself that. Some other people started calling me that. And I was like, wow, maybe I am a textile artist. So yeah, I think when I talk about myself, I talk about myself as an artist, but I enjoy the name textile artist because I think it signifies something that is important and that we need to uplift. And textiles is a very serious and rigorous practice that people have as well. And so I think that being able to show people that as well kind of places textile arts, higher up on whatever kind of scale people are basing that on. So
That's great. That's really interesting. And it's interesting to think of it. We talk about this a lot at SDA because we have many works that are flowing in between different areas, and it's always interesting to hear artists' perspective on that. So thank you. I had
yeah, of
one
course.
question that I was dying to ask during our symposium. I didn't get a chance to, but so I'm gonna front load it here, and then we'll get to the audience questions. But I'm so interested in your braiding. It's often thought of, and not always, I think, culturally it varies, but it's often thought of as a very intimate act between two people, a mother and daughter, friends. It's something that happens in a home, maybe. And so I'm wondering how this act changes when it's communal and public and the scale is amplified, like in your works. How does that change?
I also love this question because I hadn't thought about it until you posed it, and I was like, oh snap, that's a really good question because I had always talked about this braiding act, like you said, between very intimate between yourself or another person or a group of or like a group of women specifically. And so when I started to bring it out into the larger public and had people braid, I saw that the braiding engendered those same things of like intimacy, of vulnerability, and it helps people to talk about these identity-based experiences that they have. And so I think it functions in the same way and it allows people to kind of come out of their shell as they're braiding because these memories that are being brought up are, like you said, they are intimate, they hold close, they're usually about identity and how people perceive themselves and other people. And so I think it just engenders these group braiding projects to become more people are allowed to become more honest with themselves and really get to some deep, no pun intended, rooted issues through the guise of braiding communally.
I love that. I really love that. I'm going to jump to some questions. I'm going to kind of lump a few things together.
Yeah.
We do have some questions about the hair you use, and I know we've talked a little bit about that in the past, but the ethics of real hair versus synthetic hair. There's also some questions about how you kind of wash or pre-treat the hair, or do you do that before the braiding? Why you're no longer using blonde hair, what that means, and then what does gray hair reflect for you, and do you use it? Which I loved that question, Gail.
Yes, Gail, thank you for the gray-haired question. I myself am slowly getting gray hair and I love every minute of it. And this isn't the first time this question has been posed to me at all. And I feel like when I start to, very show that I'm gray, like I feel, I'll probably feel a more passion to use it because I'll have all of that history and that knowledge about what it means to have gray hair. And so that's kind of why I'm not using it now, is because um, I just don't feel like I have the authority to talk about gray hair because, like I said, I feel like there's a respect and an acknowledgement that comes along with it. As far as the blonde hair, I did work with blonde hair, but I slowly started to see that the way that my work was going, talking about Black, Brown, and Indigenous people and having dark hair myself, I didn't really feel that blonde hair was speaking the same language as the black and brown hair. And I also use it because, black and brown people for so long have been, I mean, and still to this day, rights taken away and what have you. I could go on forever with that. So I think it's important to highlight those two colors, specifically the black color as well, because that's what I've been using for almost about a year now. And so that's why I moved away from using blonde hair and why I specifically use black and brown hair. And then as far as like pre-treating it, I usually take it and I usually like wash it, which is really funny. There's just like a bunch of hair floating in the tub, and then brush it out. I don't like straighten it or anything like that, but I make sure to wash it before I use it. And I know that there was a question about the ethics of using real hair versus synthetic hair. There's this really good book by Emma Tarlow called Entangled, and it talks about the secret lives of hair and where this human hair come from. I'm speaking specifically about human hair. And the hair trade is a really messy and dirty place. And also there's a lot of stories about uh, people using hair in like spells and stuff like that. So I don't know if I want to be trusted using someone's hair, and I don't want to be complicit in the hair trade as well. So I will say also, I do use synthetic hair. I am moving right now towards banana fiber based hair, which is great because it's not only great for the environment because the Kanekalon hair that I use is mostly based in plastic, but I feel like the banana fiber hair is kind of again rooted back to what I'm talking about, because we can think of like uh, the trade of bananas and the history that comes along with that. And I'm really into using history in my work. And so I think that there is some crossover there. I haven't really parsed it out all of the way, but that's the kind of hair I use, why I use it, and speaking to the colors that I use as well too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Kind of building off of a little bit of the what you just referenced. Mary asks about how you balance research and doing. They say that's an issue in their practice. I love to research, but it's easier for me to do than making. And making means bringing a voice out into the world. And so how do you balance that in your practice?
That's a good question. I don't know. Not to be so glib about it, but like I I guess the way that I approach it is I'm a maker first. And so I will start by making. I mean, I've been working in my field for almost 15 years now. And so I know the materials, I know what I want to use, I know how I want it to be shaped. And the research for me comes after the making. And I feel like I'm answering this a little bit off the path right now, but I I make something and then the research comes after, like I said, and it's not always part and parcel, like it doesn't always go together. And so I'm not giving a very good answer because I kind of fit it in where I can fit it in the research, you know what I mean? And maybe this is a more technical question, but if I have a really big sculpture due soon, or I have to meet a deadline, I should say, I'll listen to stuff on my audiobooks. And so that's a form of research for me too. Or I'll watch something or listen to something as I'm doing it and take notes from there. And so, I don't I'm really good at what's that called when you can do a couple different things at once?
Multitasking.
Multitasking. I'm very good at multitasking, which sometimes pays off and sometimes doesn't pay off because you really want to give yourself over to the research sometimes because you might miss certain things, or vice versa in the making, you might miss that. And so, at least for me, I guess the best answer I can give is it starts with the making for me. And then towards the end of the process, I go into the research afterwards. Um, yeah, I don't know how I fit it all in.
Yeah,
We
that's
find
really interesting.
we find ways in our day.
That is really interesting. Another question, when you work in community with challenging stories, how do you create a supportive, safe environment for what may come out? Are there shared resources for further processing afterwards, or what? How do you handle it with love?
That's a great question too. And I had that posed to me about 2 years ago when I was at USM because I hadn't thought about that. And I was teaching this class about community, and someone brought that up, and I was like, oh, snap, like I'm doing a disservice to these people by asking them to tell me a story that's very hard and difficult without giving them any kind of like resources to help them process further. And so now when I do the braiding circles, say it's in like a specific place, if it's in Maine or it's in New Jersey or it's in Wisconsin, I'll find different places where you can go for support, or find like a national number that people can call. Um, and so I also offer myself because I used to be a grief counselor. And so I also offer myself if there's any offloading that needs to be done afterwards for peer support. And I also front load a lot of these conversations too with like, please do not share if if you feel some kind of way about it, because I don't want to be responsible for you reliving the trauma. And I've had people get up and leave the braiding circles because of it, and that's okay. You need to feel good in the space that you're in for the work that I'm doing, and I'm not here to exploit anyone either. And this comes from me being a community organizer and being in the community working with different individuals. Like, people are my top priority, and the safety and well-being of people are too. And so that's kind of how I overcome those, not overcome, but that's how I engender compassion and understanding and empathy, which is what I want to do with these braiding circles, is by giving people not only the outlet to speak freely in my circles, but then an outlet if they need to speak to someone further by giving them these resources as well.
That's amazing. That's an amazing aspect of the practice, I think. We had a couple questions also about the site-specific pieces. Stephanie asks, were the coastline installations meant to be experienced in person, or since they dissolved so quickly, did you find ways to show the video of the experience afterward? And they're wondering about the reactions you receive from people who experience them. And then Sandra, also to build on that, was asking if the sugar damages the site ecosystem, or have you thought about that?
Yeah, I'm glad that that question was posed. I usually get that question every single time, and I'm very happy to get that question. I worked with a biologist at USM to ensure that the sugar placed into the ecosystem and the animals around it, it wouldn't damage it. And they told me that it wouldn't damage it. So I went on my merry way and did what I needed to do. And also, yes, the piece was supposed to be experienced there. Unfortunately, not everybody can be there at that time. Oh, and let me back up for a second. I worked with someone at USM. That's the University of Southern Maine. So I just wanted to not just say USM, like everybody knows what I'm talking about. But to get back to the question I was answering, it was supposed to be experienced in person. It was during COVID. So a lot of people were not out, um, which is why I have the videos of it. And so I didn't have many conversations with people at the actual site. I had conversations with people after the fact as they were viewing it. And the one top thing I got was, I wish I could have been there. And I'm like, well, yeah, like that's the point of the piece, is to experience it in person. But I also know people's capacities around that time and accessibility issues. And so I wish more people could have been around to experience it. Um, but that's how it goes sometimes. So maybe I'll do it again.
I just have one final question. I have this list of sort of, I'm really struck by the tension in your work. So I have this list of all these sort of opposites that came up: trauma and healing, hard and soft, personal and public, dissolving and permanent, heavy and light, erasure and recording. I've got like 5 more that I can't quite read. But there's a lot of tension. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm so happy you asked me that. I want that list. And no, and I can talk about that for sure because I would always work in this space of drama, tension, like powerless, and all of these words that kind of went to lack of a better term, to the dark side, to the negative. And there was always this kind of like anxiety inside of me of like, why isn't this work reading the way I need it to? And I realized that with you have to have joy with sadness. You have to have dark with light. Like you have to have these two opposites for these two things to actually be to work together. Like you said, there's that tension inherent in the work. And I think it comes from, like you said, me using these opposites, but I didn't really know that until I really saw like how the work was hitting. And it was hitting like, well, there's no, like, it's all doom and gloom. Like, where is the happiness? There has to be something else outside of that. And so I'm glad that you caught that within my work, because it's something that I have been working on for a couple of years and really want to bring a little bit forward, because like I said, we need resistance and we need joy, and we can't just have darkness without the light, because then what are we really doing here?
Thank you so much. We are right at the hour. It is so wonderful to see you again. We're so appreciative you've coming today. Thank you for the great questions from the audience. It was fun to revisit the symposium theme, which was a joy to be around the entire week that we had it. We have a lot of great programming this spring, from workshops, exhibitions, calls for entry, meetups at SDA. We're throwing those in the chat if you want to check them out. And as a reminder, this recording will be available next week on the Textile Talk playlist. Next week's Textile Talk will be Stitch Buffalo, hosted by Studio Art Quilt Associates. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Veronica. It's great to see you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.